He's showing us a little bit deeper than, he who owns the gold makes the rules. Capital matters here. Ownership matters. Control matters. If you're not going to build the capital, somebody else is going to have to provide it. And when they get to provide it, they get to set the terms. And if they get to set the terms, you're going to spend your life pretty much asking for permission. That's not really just a money issue. It's a deeper freedom issue.
Welcome to the Bankless by Design podcast, where we rethink money, ditch the system, and rediscover what it means to truly thrive well. I'm Tricia Miller, mom of 7, financial coach, and founder of ThriveWell. Around here, we believe wealth is more than numbers. It's about freedom, stewardship, and building a legacy that lasts. If you're ready to challenge the norm and take back control of your financial life, you're in the right place.
Hello and welcome to the Bankless by Design podcast. I'm Tricia Miller and I'm here today with my son Jonathan as we continue walking through the human problems section in Becoming Your Own Banker. Today we're going to be looking at the golden rule, and not the golden rule that most of us grew up hearing. Not do unto others as you would have them do unto you. No, instead Nelson gives us a financial version. He who has the gold makes the rules. And Jonathan, this is one of those short sections in the book that's easy to read quickly, but if you slow down, it is packed. So good to have you with me today.
Excited to be here.
When I first read this section, I thought I understood it pretty well. Whoever owns the gold makes the rules, makes sense, simple enough. But as usual, the more I study Nelson, the more I realize he's usually pressing on something deeper than that first layer. And this chapter is not just about having more money. It's about capital, control, and whether we are willing to become responsible owners.
It is easy to get a little lost in this first section because Nelson starts with he who has the gold makes the rules, and then he's talking about Panasonic, Mexico, the Constitution, Shakespeare. So you're first kind of like, where are we going with all this?
Exactly. And this is why we're going to slow down a little bit. In this first part, we're going to focus mainly on Nelson's argument about capital, ownership, and control. And the next time, we're going to get into the Constitution and Shakespeare and why I think Nelson is pressing on something even deeper. And that is our human tendency to prefer dependence over the responsibility of ownership. But let's start where Nelson starts. Would you mind reading that very first opening paragraph for us?
Sure thing. The golden rule. Those who have the gold make the rules. We all have the tendency to chuckle when we see this perversion of a principle that was learned in childhood, one that serves us very well, that we should do unto others as we would have them do unto us. But this corruption is very true also. I think that it is a pity that it is not often looked upon with favor. Perhaps it is because we have almost lost the concept of what capitalism is all about. The common man has become so infatuated with living for today that the importance of saving, of creating capital, is all but a lost value. The American savings rate is miserably low. At the time of this writing, it has been negative. Last month, it was at an all-time low.
And I have a feeling it hasn't been any better recently. But just to back up a little bit, Nelson is not denying the golden rule as we know it, right? But here he gives us what he calls a corrupted version, and it's blunt. Those who have the gold make the rules.
Blunt, but it's still true.
Yes. If someone else owns or controls the gold, they get to set the terms. They get to make the rules. They have the power.
Right. So if I walk into a bank and want to borrow their money, I have to do it on their terms. So they get to decide whether they're going to lend to me at all. They decide how much and at what interest rate they're going to lend to me. They decide the payback schedule that I'm going to have to pay them back for it, the payment amount itself, all of it. So, they get to make the rules and I have to follow them if I want access to their money.
And just like we talked about in Willie Sutton's law, the same thing applies when the government provides the tax benefit. If the government creates that tax qualified plan, then the government also gets to make the rules around that plan. So same principle. It's not complicated. It's almost like the law of gravity, right? And Nelson wants us to understand this because he wants us to see how important it is to get some of our own gold. Not because we want to throw around power indiscriminately or be greedy, but because we need to stop living permanently dependent on someone else's capital. And that's the main point.
So it's not that I should just get rich to boss other people around?
No, not at all. He's not at all saying go get gold so that you can dominate other people. That is not the spirit of becoming your own banker at all. He is saying we just need to be aware. This is a fact. If you own the gold, you have power. Capital has power. And if you never build it for yourself, you never control it, you never steward it well, then you're going to spend much of your life living under the rules of those who do. And this is important because this section is right in the middle of the human problems in this book. And he's diagnosing the human condition. So I don't want to forget that context because that will play out a little bit further down the road here. But the human problem section has a flow to it. So let me just walk through this a little bit first. We had Parkinson's law in the very beginning of this section. And Parkinson's law is about expenses rise to meet income, right? So before we ever can talk about becoming our own banker, we have to deal with the fact that most of us consume everything that comes into our lives. And that has to be conquered first. There has to be some margin. If you can beat Parkinson's law, then you're going to start accumulating wealth. Well, what happens next? Then we face Willie Sutton. And Willie Sutton's law is that wherever wealth accumulates, someone is going to try to steal it. So we have to now protect it.
So Nelson is really walking us through three big questions. Can you create capital? Can you protect the capital? And then will you control your capital?
That's right. Yes. Or to say it another way, control your capital or someone else will. That vacuum will always be filled. So notice that Nelson goes on to say that it is a pity that this corrupted golden rule is not looked upon with more favor. Perhaps because we've lost the concept of what capitalism is all about.
So what do you think he means by that exactly? Because when most people think of capitalism today, they may think of greedy capitalists, and, it doesn't exactly have a positive reputation in every circle.
That's right. I think there is a general perspective that to be a capitalist is somehow a dirty word because it's so associated today with the ultra wealthy, with special favors, with crony capitalism and all of that. And that is a problem. But I think what Nelson is getting at here is a much cleaner, more basic idea of capitalism. He's talking about private property rights, individual people owning their own resources, people producing goods and services that contribute to a flourishing economy and a free market without government intervention, not these special favors. And so while these ideas obviously have implications on a national level, I really think in this chapter, Nelson really has his eye specifically on the individual. Because he goes on to say that the common man has become so infatuated with living for today that the importance of saving and of creating capital is all but a lost value. And again, this is speaking to the human problem.
Yeah. A couple of things come to mind for me here. First, I think it's pretty hard, for people in my generation to do much else but live for now, it feels like, because, so many people are stretched so thin and, you're just trying to get by paycheck to paycheck, day by day. I also hear Nelson saying that we have to learn to think long range, which, he talks about often.
Nelson is he's stressing the importance of saving, of creating capital. And I do think it is challenging. I'm not, in any way saying that it's not. And I would also add that in an economy where inflation has been so crippling, regular savings, or as Nelson puts it, creating capital, is even more important, even as challenging as that may be.
So before you go any further, can I ask about that word capital that you're using? So Nelson keeps saying capital instead of just money. Is there a difference here? And why do you think Nelson's using that so intentionally?
That is a good question. And yes, there is a difference. Money is a much broader term. Technically, money is a medium of exchange. You go to work, you receive an income. That income can be used to buy groceries, pay bills, just sit in a checking account. But capital is different. Capital has to do with the function of money. Capital is money that has been saved and positioned in such a way that it can go to work for you for the long haul. So a dollar spent at Target is money that's just simply consumed, right? You spend that dollar and it's gone. Or maybe even if you put it in a savings account, if it's a short term just to satisfy an emergency, even that is just money. But a dollar that you have set aside specifically to position it in a way that might build a business, buy equipment for that business because that equipment is going to then help you earn money, to fund a real estate deal, or In this case, with becoming your own banker, it would be capitalizing a properly designed life insurance policy. Now that dollar is actually functioning as capital. It becomes a store of value that can then be leveraged, and ultimately it's to create cash flow so that it is more sustainable for the future, which always reminds me of what Nelson teaches in other places where he says there's only two sources of income: people at work and money at work. And I believe it's on page 85 where he says, could it be that not enough people have money at work? So the big difference is that money is just spent, goes through our hands. But when it's gathered and organized to go to work, it can be considered working capital. So very intentional, I think, in using that term, capital, capitalizing. Big difference here would be the consumer says, how much money do I have to spend this weekend? Whereas a banker says, how much capital do I control and how can I put it to work without destroying it? Very different way of thinking.
Yeah, so capital is not just having more money or more dollars. It's having dollars and money positioned in a way that can create more wealth or more opportunity for you.
Right. And that is why this matters in this section, because the golden rule is not merely he who has money flowing through his hands makes the rules, okay? We all have money flowing through our hands. But if it just flows through a bucket with holes in it, that isn't going to do you any good. The difference is whether we are keeping any of it, organizing it, and putting it in a place where it's going to build something that lasts. So capital very much has to do with ownership, access, control, and ultimately cash flow. And banks understand this. They don't become powerful simply because they have dollars sitting around. They become powerful because they control organized pools of capital. And they understand how to lend against that capital again and again, creating a constant source of cash flow. So I think Nelson is using that word very intentionally because he wants us to see that. And I'll be honest, it is something that I have been learning. I have built capital and used it, but maybe never made quite the same distinction in my mind between money and capital until I really got into becoming your own banker and understanding what Nelson meant when he talks about capitalization. And we're going to see this more played out in the Panasonic example coming up in this text. But before we go there, I want us to look at the next very short paragraph. Would you go ahead and read that for us?
Yeah, sure thing. As a result, someone else must provide the capital that is necessary to sustain our way of life. This strategy carries with it a very high cost, and we all suffer the consequences. It all begins with faulty premises. It seems to me what Nelson's saying here is that because we haven't saved our money or especially created capital for that long term, we have to go to somebody else to provide the capital that we need. So is he meaning, that this is exactly why we have to look to banks for financing in the first place, because we don't actually have our own capital here, to go buy a car or, so when you do, you have to pay interest to somebody else for their capital. Like he talked about earlier in the book that, 34.5% of every dollar we have is typically going to interest, and I assume that's the high cost he's referring to here.
Yes, that is what he's referring to, I believe. And I don't want to miss this last sentence, though. He says it all begins with a faulty premise. I think this is really important because the premise is like the foundation beneath the structure. It's like the foundation of the Empire State Building. Without that solid foundation, the whole thing falls. So when he says a faulty premise, I think we need to understand exactly what he means. I think we will see that here in this next example. So without reading the whole thing, Nelson basically gives us the story of Panasonic. He says, imagine how wonderful it would be to put Japanese capital together with Mexican labor. And in saying this, he just means that the Japanese had a lot of capital and the Mexicans needed employment. So if you were to put those two things together, you should have a very productive business. But here's what wound up happening. The Mexican government intervened and said no business could be established in their country unless 51% of the business was controlled by the Mexicans. Well, in theory, that sounds great, right? They're protecting their people. We want to own and control the business. The problem is that the Mexicans were not supplying the capital to have that privilege. They were supplying the labor, that's true, but they did not have the capital. And the principle goes, those who own the gold makes the rules, right? So this is where Nelson gets a little bit into the mindset issue because he is going to go on to talk about the typical Japanese strategy And we're actually comparing two mindsets in this example. So when the Japanese have a strategy, it says that they put money into a business and you should expect to lose money for 5 years. And then when you start actually making money after 5 years, you still plow it all back into the business for 5 more years. And only after that time should you actually expect to take money out of the business. That's a different mindset than what you see here with the Mexican government, at least, saying they were basically demanding a bonus at the very start. Right away, they want to have the 51% ownership. Do you see the problem Nelson is trying to get at here? Do you see the difference in this mindset?
Yeah, and first, right off the bat, you have the government intervening, so there's an initial problem. But they're also, what they're expecting is not necessarily realistic. They're not the ones with the actual startup capital to get the business off the ground, so they can't reasonably expect to own a majority share of the business.
That's true, and yet I think it's even more than that.
Yeah, that's fair. It's the mindset actually about the money. Like the Japanese mindset here is that, you should expect to invest and lose money for 5 years. And the Mexican mindset in the example is that they were expecting to make money right from the jump. And, in fact, they expected to even own more of the business initially than the Japanese without making the same kind of investment of the capital.
Right, right. So I don't want to jump over that Japanese strategy too quickly, because to think that they would expect to lose money for the first 5 years, and then even after you start making money, plowing it back into the business for 5 more years. So only after 10 years, the Japanese would expect to actually take any money out of the business. Why do you think that is their strategy?
I'm going to assume because by that point, the business is actually established, enough and strong enough to be a money-making machine for you to, take money out without collapsing it and making it fall apart. Before that point, it's probably not sustainable enough to take something from it.
Absolutely. You get an A for that answer, Jonathan.
Business school, yay.
Yes, okay. But it's all of that. The expectation of loss, the willingness to plow it back into the business. It's definitely a long-range mindset. It's being willing to be disciplined long enough to actually build something worth building. That's that foundation, right? So this idea of capitalizing a system takes a mindset shift that many of us just aren't willing to do. And I can tell you, when prospective clients come to me, there are two mindsets that I often deal with. The first is, how in the world can I afford that premium? They see it as a bill to be paid, not as capital to be built. There's a difference. And then the second thing is, how quickly can I get access to that money? And yes, you can get access to a portion of that money quite quickly, but is that always the best idea? Nelson says we should not be afraid to capitalize. Even in the examples later on in the book, we'll see where he shows them putting 4 and 5, sometimes 7 years worth of capital together before beginning to access it, because he wants you to be well capitalized. It is this exact same principle that he's showing us here with the Japanese. So it doesn't just mean don't be afraid to pay a high premium. It also means don't be afraid to put your money somewhere that you're not going to touch for a while, because you are about building a solid foundation that's going to go the distance. And ultimately, this is all about the way that you think. It always comes back to that. So let's find out what happened to this Panasonic deal with the Japanese and the Mexicans.
I think you might be able to guess what happens, but it ended up not going so well, at least not for the Mexicans in this example. And they didn't end up getting their employment opportunity, and Panasonic ended up taking the business somewhere else.
Absolutely. And why would they do anything else? Why would you take this investment of your hard-earned capital and then agree to let somebody else have more than majority share ownership? Nobody would do that. Panasonic had the gold, so they got to make the rules. They were not about to do that. And you wouldn't do it either. So notice Nelson's commentary here, because he says capital is a responsibility and it should be treated with great respect. Then if not, then all parties involved will lose. The Japanese respected their capital, so they went elsewhere where their capital was going to be respected. And unfortunately, that meant that the Mexicans lost out on the opportunity altogether. But let's just play devil's advocate. Let's just say that the Japanese agreed to those terms. What would have happened?
Well, Imagine that since the Mexican side in this example, was expecting the majority ownership without putting up their own capital, they probably wouldn't have run the business necessarily the best once it got started either. They wouldn't have had the expectation to lose money for 5 years and then reinvest their capital for another 5 years. So you'd have a conflict of mindset just immediately. And, they would have expected that immediate windfall that's, referenced in the example as well. And they could have taken that windfall immediately, whether the business was actually doing well or not. And then the whole thing could have fallen apart from that. So, then both parties actually really would have lost.
Exactly. So Nelson says here, he says, it is actually difficult to write about this because it seems so obvious. So even just going through that exercise seems foolish. And I want to just say this too. This is not to disparage one culture over another. I don't think that was Nelson's point either. It is not a commentary on the Japanese or the Mexican people. The point is to just demonstrate an actual story of what happened, what the mindset around money was. And if we're honest, most of us actually share the mindset demonstrated by the Mexicans more than we do the Japanese in this example. I mean, I know I can be guilty of it. I don't always exercise that kind of discipline, that kind of patience. I don't have that kind of patience. I would be foolish to say that I do.
As we're working through this example, actually, I was just thinking of my own small business that I own. I was like, wow, I can't imagine if I just expected to lose a little bit of money for 5 years, reinvested all my capital in my business for 5 years, and then started taking money back. Because like you said, I'm definitely guilty of being like, oh, well, I made a little bit of profit there. I could take that and use that somewhere else. So, yeah.
100%. I think most of us would be guilty if we're honest about that. But here, Nelson is going to move into this idea that if you are the one who owns the gold, like Panasonic, you actually have choices. When you have a large amount of cash on hand, all sorts of good opportunities will appear. And you can also negotiate very favorable purchase prices because you're in control, right? You have the advantage and the leverage of the negotiation. Quite frankly, the other party cannot move forward without you. In that example, the Mexicans couldn't build that business without the capital, even though they could supply the labor. It's going to take capital. This is true in every transaction. Because I've been in real estate, what comes to mind for me is a real estate negotiation. A few years ago, when we had the crazy seller's market, I would sometimes have 15 or 20 offers coming in for my sellers. And the fear of every buyer was the cash buyer who might swoop in at the last minute and get the deal. And of course they did, because they had the cash. Most sellers were going to accept that deal first because they did not have to wonder whether financing would fall through with the bank. There was a greater certainty. The rest of the buyers, they were in the dependent on the bank position. They did not personally own or control their own capital. But the one who did, they could close in 10 days. They could make the stronger offer. Even if they offered less money most of the time, the seller would take that deal first.
Yeah, that makes sense. And, I can see that on a smaller scale represented too. Even with our family banking systems, there's been times when, access to that meant I could move quickly on other opportunities that, I'd come across for my business. So if I found something I'd been looking for, I could act quickly on it. And I wasn't necessarily waiting on, personal loan, or if I had enough money on my credit card, I could just come to the family bank.
Exactly. And I think those little examples matter because they help us see that this is not just theory. And Nelson experienced these opportunities himself. He talks us about the story of a landowner that he knew that needed cash. So he was willing to sell the land at a very reduced price if Nelson could come up with the cash quickly. And of course, Nelson was like, hang on, I will be right back. He's going to take a policy loan, and he comes right back because he's got the ability to access his cash value through his whole life policies. He was able to more than once get very good deals because of being capitalized. Having the capital gives you options. Nelson goes on to say here, many of life's problems would disappear if this understanding was generally accepted and practiced widely among the population. Individuals can reap the rewards that such discipline yields. So, Jonathan, what is your takeaway so far from this section? How does this help you rethink your own thinking?
I think the biggest thing is that capital gives you options. And as you were just saying, in my business, especially, speed is everything. I deal with motivated sellers where most of the time people are selling collections because they're in a tight spot and they need cash quickly. So whoever has the capital first gets there first, can get the deal. So, if you don't actually have your own capital, you're always waiting on somebody else, and you need the bank to say yes. You need the lender to approve to you. You need someone else to provide what you do not have. And now in my family banking example, I have a quick response because I can text you. It's not like an actual bank, but if you have, the capital, you are putting yourself in a stronger position. You can move quicker, you can negotiate better, you can see opportunities and actually act on them, and I think the other side of it is that mindset piece. For me, it's easy to think, when can I use the money? Like I said, I'm always trying to quickly get on another deal, negotiate, etc. And sometimes, Nelson seems to say, we need to slow down, build the capital first, protect it long enough to actually let it become productive, then, go utilize it.
Right, right. Capital definitely gives you options, but it has to be respected. I think that's an important piece. It will go where it's respected and protected and allowed to work. It is a law of gold. Similar, I think, to the laws of gold talked about in The Richest Man in Babylon. There's just certain ways that money and capital works. So we must learn to respect our own capital. And it's something that families really need to hear. We say that we want generational wealth, but generational wealth requires more than dollars. It requires a certain way of thinking. If the first generation builds it, but the next generation does not understand the importance of capital, then they're just going to consume what was built. So it's important that we teach not just the mechanics of becoming your own banker, but the mindset as well.
Yeah, I know that's what you're trying to start doing with us as well.
Yeah. I don't want my children to just inherit money. I want you to inherit the wisdom and the understanding that goes along with it so that it can be sustainable and be for the benefit of my children's children. And I will say, I do believe this is where The Richest Man in Babylon has been very helpful to me. And I think it actually helped me understand becoming your own banker even more. So I just want to bring one more nugget from it because I think it ties everything that we've talked about together today. So Clayson, in The Richest Man in Babylon, he uses a character named Algamish as the teacher to teach some of his students on the art of building wealth. So Algamish tells his students, every piece of gold that you save is a slave to work for you. Every copper it earns is its child that can also earn for you. So if you would become wealthy, then what you save must go to work and earn, and its children must earn. So again, there's that idea, people at work or money at work. But that's not the end of the story. Algamish checks in with his student who's been putting into practice the art of accumulating wealth. He's about 2 years into his tutelage with Algamish when he checks back in with him and he says, "What progress have you made since I last saw you?" He says, "I have paid myself faithfully, and my savings I have entrusted to Agar, the shield maker, to buy bronze, and each 4th month he pays me the rental." And Algamish says back to him, "That is good. And what do you do with the rental?" He says, "I do have a great feast with honey and fine wine and spices and cake." To which Algamish laughed and he says, "You do eat the children of your savings. Then how do you expect them to work for you? And how can they have children that will also work for you? First, get you an army of golden slaves, and then many a rich banquet may you enjoy without regret." So did you catch that? The student has done the hard work. He's learned to live within his means, to set aside some gold. He's busy protecting it, and he's even putting it to work for him. But here's where he's failed. He has failed in that he starts to eat from those earnings too quickly. And that is exactly what the Japanese understood in Nelson's example. Capital is not something to raid too quickly. It has to be protected, reinvested, and allowed to reproduce. You want an army of golden slaves working for you. Your savings should begin to have children, and then those children begin to have more children. That is long-range thinking. But if I save $1, I put it to work, and immediately spend everything that it produces, I've eaten the child of my savings. If I keep doing that, that dollar never becomes a true wealth-building system. The beauty is that when I pay a premium into a dividend-paying whole life insurance contract, it almost has a bit of a discipline mechanism built in because this is exactly what it does. You pay a premium. That premium is not a bill. It is seed capital. It buys a death benefit. It creates contractual cash value. Then when those dividends are paid, which is like the children of your savings, those dividends can buy more paid up additional insurance. That additional insurance creates more cash value, and that creates more dividends. And so now we have grandchildren, okay? And on it goes, compounding uninterrupted. So the seed capital does not just simply disappear from your life. It's being put to work inside a system. It's building a storehouse of value that can continue to grow and be accessed over time. That's why I think Nelson is not merely saying, save some money, right? He's saying capitalize, build a storehouse of value, protect it, give it a job, let it reproduce, and don't consume the seed. And that is what premium is doing when we understand it correctly. So you're not paying a bill, you're building your own business. Over time, you're going to be able to take over and more of your financing needs in life instead of remaining dependent on third-party banks and all of that interest flowing away from you. You're becoming the owner who controls the gold. But here's the key. You don't do that carelessly. You have to do it honestly, responsibly, and faithfully, because becoming your own banker is not just about gaining control. It's about also becoming the kind of person who can steward that well.
So I think, when you start to slow down and you really think about it, he's showing us a little bit deeper than, he who owns the gold makes the rules.
Right.
He's telling us that, capital matters here. The ownership matters. The control matters. And if you're not, going to build the capital, somebody else is going to have to provide it. And then, when they get to provide it, they get to set the terms. And if they get to set the terms, you're going to spend your life pretty much asking for permission. And, that's not really just a money issue. It's a deeper freedom issue. And, the next time I know that Nelson's going to take us even deeper in this section, because, after he shows us that capital creates that control, he moves it into something a little more interesting, and what happens when people forget who's supposed to be in charge.
Absolutely. He winds up bringing in the Constitution. He brings in Shakespeare's idea that all the world's a stage. And I think he brings us right to the heart of the human problem section. And that is that our tendency is to actually prefer dependency over the responsibility of ownership. And that sounds crazy perhaps, but I don't think it is. So we're going to pick that up in part 2. Does that sound good?
Sounds great. I can't wait.
All right. Me too. So before we go, though, I want to leave you with one question. And that is just to ask yourself, am I treating my money like it's something to spend? Or am I learning to turn it into capital? Because that's really the first lesson in this, I believe, that Nelson is pressing on us. Money is going to pass through your hands, but capital is going to be gathered and put to work and allowed to reproduce. So this week, just sit with that. Am I only making money, or am I building capital? And if you're ready to begin thinking through what it could look like to build capital in your own life, in your family, or in your business, then please reach out to me at banklessbydesign.com, or you can email me at Tricia, that's Tricia, at banklessbydesign.com as well. And I would love to have a conversation with you. So, Jonathan, thank you so much for being here today. And thank you so much for listening in to the Bankless by Design podcast. I hope it was fun for you and I hope it was insightful. And if you found it helpful, would you share it with someone else who might need to hear this? And leave us a comment. We'd love to hear your feedback. Until next time, I hope you have a great rest of your week.
Thanks for tuning in to the Bankless by Design podcast, where we're done with the system and we're doing money differently. Be sure to subscribe, share this episode with someone who needs it, and visit us at banklessbydesign.com to learn how you can start living bankless by design.